Our next speaker is David Ewalt, who is an award-winning reporter for Information Week, the world's largest weekly technology magazine, and publisher of Dropping Science, which is somewhat similar to Dropping Acid, a new weblog. He has previously worked for media outlets including Newsday, Village Voice, and the Sesame Workshop. Sesame Workshop. I'd like to welcome David Ewalt. And Skeptics in the media, making your voice heard.
Well, I guess I should start out by saying that despite what it says in your schedules, I'm not a doctor yet, don't have my PhD yet. I think what happened is if you do an internet search on my name, you can come up with the other David Ewalt, who is a urologist in East Texas. It's a fairly common mistake. I mean, every year I get 3 or 4 emails that were intended for him. So I'll tell you the same thing I tell those people, which is, no, I don't want to hear about your bladder problem. If you're like Dean Cameron, you have a spastic colon, please just keep that information to yourself. What I want to do today, I'm not a doctor, I am a working reporter. And I want to do something a little different here, which is address an issue that we've been talking about on and off the last couple of days. And it's this question of how do we get our message out there? How do we get more attention from the media? How do we get our story told? How do we get on TV instead of John Edward? Well, we're not doing that, obviously. This is a problem that needs to be addressed. And why does this problem exist? Well, one of the main reasons is, the media is full of bullshit. The media is full of stuff like John Edward. He has his own TV show. James Randi doesn't. Somebody like Sylvia Browne appears on a major news show. It's supposed to be credible, something like Larry King. She's on that fairly often. And then you've got big network news magazines, things like Dateline and these primetime news shows that regularly do stories about homeopathy or other stuff that's just entirely credulous and doesn't provide a good skeptical view. One of my favorite examples of bad media in the last year or so is a story I found last year. This is, it was written by a local television station. They ran it on their nightly broadcast. And this was on their website, too. If you can't read the title, it says, researchers, thousands of Bigfoots prowling the country. And the story goes on to explain that there's a fisherman in northern Wisconsin who says he's seen Bigfoot several times in the last couple of decades. No validation of this, but they go on to interview Bigfoot experts. They explain to us there's between 2,000 and 6,000 Bigfoot wandering around the country. It provides you with safety tips. If you see a Bigfoot, don't run because you'll upset it and then it's going to come after you. And apparently there's a real problem with Sasquatch eating dogs. So don't let your pets out in the woods because they're going to snack on them. But this is the kind of stuff that we have to deal with fairly often. And so when we see stories like this, when the media does get it wrong, what can we do to combat it? One of the most basic ways, and this is something we all know about, is writing letters to the editor. But there's kind of an art to doing this. It's not just, I'm going to fire something off to the address that they print in the magazine and hope that it gets somewhere. First thing you need to do, most of the time, is be polite. A lot of newspapers, magazines get a lot of messages. And because the people who tend to be the most fervent and the most likely to do something like write a letter to the editor, they're often cranks. They're often people who have nothing better to do, who are really, kind of out of control. So a lot of letters just kind of get filed into the crank file. Here's somebody who's just being vitriolic, who's not making any sense. We're not really going to pay any attention to it. We're just going to kind of throw it away. So don't fall into that trap. Be polite. The other thing you want to do is be constructive. Don't just say, hey, you got this wrong. There's no such thing as Bigfoot. If you send an email, send some links to resources on the web. Say, well, you can go to this page, and this page will explain to you why Sasquatch is a myth. Here's your evidence. You also want to suggest some sources. It's a good idea if you say, the next time a story like this comes up, what you might want to do is call the JREF or call this professor of biology at the local college. You know, if you can provide those reporters with another avenue, the next time one of these pseudoscience stories comes up, they're more likely to get the story right because they're going to use those sources. You also want to keep it short. And I mean, especially with this Bigfoot article, I wrote a long letter just tearing this woman apart and then had to trim it back down to just like a paragraph or two. We do get angry at these things, but if you send a 1,000-word email or a 1,000-word letter, you're going straight into the crank file, and they're not going to pay any attention to you. Another good idea is to get other people involved. Newspapers especially get a lot of letters to the editor, so a good way to increase your chances of getting noticed is to get other people to write letters too. Get your friends, get your family. I would suggest things like going to the JREF forum and ask people there, say, hey, I found this story, let's write some letters. Don't use boilerplate. Don't everybody send in the same letter, because then that's going to get written off as, you know, maybe this is one person who just signed 20 names. Let everybody write their own letter. Another important thing is to address the letter to the right place. You know, most newspapers and magazines have a letters to the editor address. You know, frequently it's letters at LasVegasHerald.com or something like that. Those addresses get so many emails, so many letters that you're going to get lost in the crowd. So the better thing to do is address the message correctly. Seek out the actual reporter and the actual editors involved in the production of that article. You know, look at the byline and see the name of the reporter, and look in the masthead, you know, the list of all the people who work for that place. See if that actual reporter's email is listed, and they usually are, and send it to that person. You also want to send it to their boss, because that's what's going to keep the reporter honest. Look for something like news editor or managing editor, and send your letter to that person too. Because then, number one, the reporter's going to say, I got caught on this, and my boss saw it, so I'm going to be more careful next time. And the editor's going to say, I'm going to be a little bit more careful about assigning a story like this next time. Now, I made the point earlier about always being polite, but there are certainly exceptions to that. And the other day, Bob Park said something which I think made a lot of sense, which was, I want to put in a word for ridicule. It's a pretty blunt instrument, but sometimes it's the only one we've got. And I think this is absolutely true. I mean, right now, I write about technology, and I made a pretty classic mistake. About a month ago, I wrote that something had however many kilobytes of memory instead of kilobits, which is an easy mistake, but a pretty significant one. And I got an email the day later. It was really rude, obnoxious, this person saying, you know, where do you get off? How can you be writing about technology if you make this basic mistake? And I deleted the letter. We didn't run it. I don't like that person, but it embarrassed me. And I tell you what, I am never going to make that particular mistake again. At the same time, though, there's another side to this polite versus vitriolic thing, which is don't always be negative. Don't just write a letter to the editor when you see something that's wrong, when you see the Bigfoot story. If somebody writes a good story, if they quote the JREF, if they write something saying UFOs aren't real, send a letter too and say, hey, good job, I like that. Because the same thing's going to happen. You're going to reinforce with the editors and the reporters that they should do more stories like that. You can also get your own stories out there by pitching them to the media directly. You'd be surprised by how many stories in magazines and newspapers don't come from the reporters themselves. They're handed to us by people who say, hey, I think this is interesting, you can cover this. It's a little bit of an art. You have to make sure you target the right people. Don't just send a random email to the newspaper and say, hey, let's talk about this. Find out who the reporter is who usually, if you want a story about your local skeptics group, find out who the reporter is who usually does those local community group interest stories. Send it to that person. Make sure you're targeting the right people. And kind of, it helps to sort of do the story for them. Provide the conclusion. Tell them, this is why this is relevant. This is why this is important. This is why you should write the story.